At first glance, early decision in college admissions seems like a good deal that benefits students because it promises higher admissions chances. But upon closer inspection, it's mostly bullshit. Many elite universities offer binding early decision deadlines that oblige students to enroll if offered admission. Early decision, or ED, differs from early action, or EA, or priority deadlines, because students may only apply to a single ED school. In contrast, most universities permit students to apply to as many EA options as they wish. Let's take a step back and see how these early deadlines evolved. The first early admissions deadlines arose in the 1950s. The 2003 book Early Admissions Game, Joining the Elite, found that applying ED confers a 100-point advantage, which subsequent 2012 research supports. Students applying ED have a significant admissions advantage because universities admit ED students at 2 or 3 times the rate of applicants applying at their final regular decision deadline. Still, many ED applicants are deferred to the regular decision pool and receive their decision later on. If a student receives their ED admissions offer, usually sometime in late November up until December 15th, they're supposed to withdraw all of their other applications. So a common question I receive, especially in November and December, is whether early decision really is binding. What happens if an admitted ED student chooses to break their agreement, especially if the family's financial situation changes? Others may simply change their minds. And the answer is a gray area, and it depends on the universities. However, legally, there is no recourse available to universities to coerce you into enrolling or paying any penalty. However, and supposedly, a university might blacklist a student or threaten to contact the student's high school guidance counselor to prevent them from sending transcripts to other universities. Although, I have no idea whatever or how many times this has happened in practice. Blacklisting to me seems like a vague threat necessary to maintain the myth of college admissions omnipotence. Threats also reinforce cartel-like behavior that maximizes a university's position at the expense of student well-being. ED deadlines are the most obvious example in the application process of the asymmetry of power between universities and families. Universities leverage binding ED deadlines to entice students into putting all of their eggs into a single basket. Initially, they were created to reduce stress for students who would find out their decision in the fall, and then they could close their application process early. Instead, it's now the most powerful tool in a university's enrollment management arsenal. ED students guaranteed to arrive on campus help admissions bureaucrats forecast how many students they need to admit through their regular deadline pools. Even at the highest echelon of university hierarchies, only 75% of admitted Harvard students, for example, enroll. The Ivy League, Stanford, Caltech, MIT, the University of Chicago, and their equivalents all compete for this same rarefied tier of students. That's one reason that even Columbia or Chicago sends these expensive, glossy recruitment brochures directly to your physical mailbox. ED poaches students who might otherwise gain admissions and enroll at prestigious peer institutions. ED practices obscure a university's overall admissions rate with the effect that many campuses are closed off to many regular decision applicants most of the time. That's one reason that I strongly caution against a shotgun approach of applying to upwards of 20 to 25 top 50 universities, because for those that practice early decision, their RD admissions rate is so low and slim, but then that in turn incentivizes students to apply to as many universities as they possibly can. Early decision application numbers nearly doubled in the past decade. Students feel pressure to apply early decision because it's yet another college arms race incentive that aids universities at the expense of students' flexibility. Applying early decision requires a substantial degree of maturity and foresight about what an applicant's future self might want. Most know that they won't stand a chance at a given university unless they attempt an ED application, so they cave into the temptation and then they hope for the best. Journalist Jeffrey Selingo wrote in his book, Who Gets In and Why, that, quote, "Few things have contributed as much to the insanity of the admissions process as early decision practices." Applying ED produces a hidden opportunity cost, where students applying for long-shot universities wait until they hear whether they gained admission or not, leaving many thousands, tens of thousands of applicants scrambling in late December to complete last-minute applications after receiving bad news. If we had a centralized college application and admission system, like in the United Kingdom's ranked preferences, or residency matching for American medical school students, then the system could much more efficiently distribute spaces to undergraduate applicants. An all-or-nothing ED option for a single school incentivizes students to game the system by finding a school that admits at early decision rates substantially higher than their regular decision rates. For example, Cornell admitted almost 23% of their ED applicants compared with 9% for regular admissions decisions. So it's questionable whether applying ED signals to universities that they're a student's genuine first choice. Dispensing with the pretense of their stated goal to match students with their top choice, some universities, such as the University of Chicago or Emory, offer early decision 2 with January deadlines. ED2 allows rejected ED1 students a second ED opportunity elsewhere. Universities likely don't care whether a student opts for ED1 or 2 as long as they arrive on campus, finish their degree, and pay their tuition. James Fallows of The Atlantic wrote a damning 2001 article, The Early Decision Racket. His observation rings as true today as it did 2 decades ago. He interviewed more than 30 public and private high school college counselors who all felt that the negatives outweighed the positive. Fallows argues, they had 3 basic complaints: that it distorts the experience of being in high school, that it worsens the professional class neuroses about college admissions, and that in terms of social class, it's nakedly unfair. One student shared that, for the great majority, no, it makes things more stressful and more painful. And this was 20 years ago, when college admissions wasn't quite so insane. Fallows establishes a correlation in the 1990s between the increasing prominence of ranking systems like the US News & World Report and a rise in early decision practices. Perverse ranking incentives and society's disproportionate focus on prestige produced unintended consequences where students pay the price. If a university admits half of their total enrollment through early decision, it allows them to push down their overall admissions rates by rejecting a far larger portion of regular decision applicants. Because acceptance rates are a heavily weighted criteria in rankings such as US News, that propels a universities up the charts, or it can help them maintain their position. Fallows writes, today's professional class madness, that being accepted or rejected from a quote good college is the most consequential fact about one's education. And this, viewed afar or from up close by people working in high schools, every part of this outlook is twisted. Less selective universities have an incentive to give the impression of higher selectivity. Highly selective universities are not incentivized to ditch ED schemes for fear of appearing less prestigious and therefore ranked lower. Every campus has an added incentive to drive application numbers higher, to select the highest scoring SAT students in order to further bolster their US News standings. And it's easier to admit high scoring students with early decisions who know that those applicants must enroll. Fallows references the University of Pennsylvania and Swarthmore that depended heavily on ED schemes in the 1990s to boost and eventually secure their prominence at the top of the US News leaderboard. The most controversial debate surrounding early decision involves a common theme: who gains access to spaces at elite American universities? Universities have debated whether to have binding ED options at all. However, a collective action problem means that if a critical mass of elite universities fail to dispense with ED practices, institutions that opt out will be punished in the rankings and in their relative prestige. Harvard's longtime admissions director, William Fitzsimmons, laments the early decision arms race among elite universities. He says, "In an ideal world, we would do away with all early programs." And Fallows responds, referring to Harvard's influence on admissions practices nationwide, that his, quote, ideal world is significant news. What holds him back is the need to know that other schools will lower their guns if he lowers his. Fallows notes that early reform efforts to cap an overall enrolling class admitted through early decision at 25% ended up failing. As a result, the early decision to regular decision ratio has been increasing ever since. At some universities, more than 50% of enrolling students on their campuses. The primary difference of Fallows' article comparing then 20 years ago and now is that families and high school staff are acutely aware of how early decision and how it also differs from non-binding early action and regular decision choices. However, navigating ED practices and options, unsurprisingly, still heavily favors wealthy families who are in the know. A winter 2006-07 article in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education discussed the evolving ED landscape since Fallows' 2001 article. Yale had announced in late 2001 that if Harvard and Princeton discontinued their early deadlines, that they would follow suit. Harvard actually did discontinue their early action deadline for fall 2008 applicants, and then they practiced non-binding early action deadlines rather than binding ED because their yield hovered around 80% anyway, which is the highest in the nation. They lost few students to their peer institutions, so they were in a unique position to be the first mover to discard their early deadline. Harvard's interim president Derek Bach commented that students from more sophisticated backgrounds and affluent high schools often apply early to increase their chances of admission, while minority students and those from rural areas, other countries, and high schools with fewer opportunities miss out. Princeton and the University of Virginia followed suit, and they also abandoned their ED policies before adopting it again a few years later. It's simply too tempting of an enrollment management tool, so its practice outweighs the benefits of enrolling a diverse student body. The article notes that few universities followed Princeton and Harvard's lead, suggesting that there is this early action and collective action problem. So let's consider how early decision influences race and diversity in college admissions. A 2012 study by researchers at Claremont McKenna in the Journal of Law and Economics tested the hypothesis of whether early decision promotes or deters enrolling diverse classes of students. They surveyed 189 national universities and small liberal arts colleges from 2004 to 7 and found that, quote, ED has a negative impact on cohort diversity. ED practices, unsurprisingly, yield significantly more white and out-of-state applicants who also tend to be wealthy. The most pronounced negative effects are for Asian Americans and Hispanic students. Their representation decreases more as schools increase their reliance on ED and/or EA programs. Even for universities that publicly commit to need-blind admissions, researchers suggest that universities have an incentive to admit slightly below average students through early decision processes, because the latter obviously are more likely to pay full tuition. The researchers hypothesize that increasing tuition prices are driven in part by ED practices that bind some portion of their enrolling class to pay full price. As a result, universities can simply charge more for their services when they know students will arrive on campus. Moreover, because ED enrollees occupy increasingly higher proportions of spaces, fewer spaces remain for the significantly more competitive regular decision applicants. If universities admitted a lower proportion of ED students, the researchers' economic model suggests that would leave more spaces for academically strong, yet still below average underrepresented students, exactly those who universities claim to admit in the name of diversity and college inclusion. However, pressures to maximize control over enrollment management outweigh administrative priorities for maximizing diversity recruitment. Subsequent recent findings by Inside Higher Ed and the left-leaning Center for American Progress report the same conclusions as that Claremont-McKenna study from 15 years ago. Consequently, and unsurprisingly, most universities most of the time will admit more students through ED at the expense of underrepresented populations. The two key takeaways from this discussion of early decision practices is that universities use them to exercise more control over enrollment management. And in turn, prioritizing enrollment management reduces every applicant's flexibility, and it compromises liberal universities who have public goals of enrolling the most diverse classes possible. Only the most highly exceptional students are likely to benefit from ED practices. And it seems to me obvious that the costs of early decision outweighs the benefits at a societal level. If elite universities were responsible stewards of educational services, and if they were accountable to the public, they would forego early decision practices entirely. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find my email in the information section of this video, so feel free to reach out if you're interested in working together.